The glint of scarlet silk against weathered gray pine was the first thing Jedediah Stone saw, and it was wrong. It was a color that had no business being that deep in the Montana Territory in 1879, miles from any town, a color as loud as a gunshot in the vast humming quiet of the mountains. He'd been tracking a 3-pronged buck for 2 days, moving with the kind of patience that hunger teaches a man, when he crested a ridge and saw the old trapper's cabin nestled in the valley below. He knew the place. Old man Hemlock had built it, and he'd been dead 4 years. The cabin should have been empty, surrendering itself back to the elements, one rotting log at a time. Instead, a thin curl of smoke, pale as a ghost, rose from the mud and stick chimney, and that impossible slash of red was hanging on a rope line strung between the door frame and a young aspen. Jedediah, a man who had spent the better part of his 30 years trying to find a place where trouble couldn't follow, felt a familiar cold tightening in his gut. Trouble had a way of wearing bright colors in desolate places. He was a homesteader now, or trying to be. He had a claim staked out 2 valleys over, a patch of stubborn ground he was slowly commencing to become a farm. He had a half-built sod house, a tired mule, and a desire for silence that was almost a physical ache. He had come here to put his guns away, to let the man he had been fade into stories told by others. But the Colt peacemaker on his hip felt heavy and solid, a piece of his past that refused to be shed, and the Winchester in his hands felt like an extension of his own arm. He eased himself down behind a granite outcrop, the stone still warm from the afternoon sun. He watched the cabin for the better part of an hour. Nothing moved except for the red silk dress, which swayed and danced in the breeze like a captive bird. It was a woman's dress, and finely made, the kind of thing a lady in San Francisco or Denver might wear, not something for the hard-scrabble life of the territory. There were no horses in the makeshift corral, no wagon tracks on the overgrown path leading to the door. Whoever was in that cabin was either a fool or dangerously good at hiding. Jedediah had known plenty of both, and the latter were always more trouble. Finally, driven by a curiosity that outweighed his caution, he started down the slope. He moved without a sound, his worn leather boots finding purchase on pine needles and loose shale. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wild thyme, but as he drew closer, another smell reached him. Jasmine. It was faint, exotic, and as out of place as the silk dress. He stopped 20 yards from the cabin, his rifle held loosely at his side. The silence was absolute now, the birds having quieted at his approach. "Hello, the cabin," he called out, his voice feeling rough and unused. "Just passing through. Saw your smoke." The red dress stilled, as if holding its breath. For a long moment, the only answer was the wind whispering through the pines. Jedediah waited. He had learned in the war that the man who moves first in a standoff is usually the man who dies. The cabin door, a crude plank construction, creaked open a few inches. He saw a sliver of darkness, then a face. It was a young woman, Chinese, her face pale and drawn, her dark eyes wide with a fear so profound it looked like a permanent part of her. In one hand she clutched a rusted skinning knife, holding it like a scepter she didn't know how to wield. She said nothing. Her gaze flickered from his face to the Winchester in his hands, to the revolver at his hip. He knew what she saw. Not a homesteader, but a threat. Another man with a gun in a world that had clearly given her no reason to trust them. "I mean you no harm," he said, keeping his voice low and even. He made no move to raise his rifle. "I'm Jedediah Stone. I've got a claim over the ridge." The woman's knuckles were white where she gripped the knife. She looked impossibly fragile against the dark interior of the cabin, yet there was a core of defiance in her stance. She was terrified, but she was not broken. She was a puzzle, a dangerous one, dropped into the middle of the quiet life he was trying to build. He could turn around, walk away, and forget the scarlet dress and the jasmine-scented air. He could go back to his stubborn piece of earth and pretend he'd seen nothing. But Jedediah knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that walking away was no longer an option. He didn't know who she was, or what had brought her to this forsaken place, but her trouble was now his, and he had a sinking feeling that the skinning knife in her hand was meant for men far more dangerous than him. The woman, whose name he would learn was Lynn, did not speak English beyond a few broken words. Communication was a frustrating dance of gestures and drawings scratched in the dirt floor of the cabin with a piece of charcoal. Therefore, Jedediah found himself acting as a reluctant protector, without knowing what he was protecting her from. He brought her the buck he eventually shot, and she showed him how to prepare the meat with wild herbs he'd never known were edible, creating a savory stew that was a world away from his usual fare of salted pork and beans. She was resourceful, he saw that quickly, but her resources were those of a different world. She knew which plants could be made into tea to soothe a cough, but she didn't know how to swing an axe without nearly taking her own foot off. A week after he found her, the sky turned a bruised purple and the heavens opened up. A brutal summer thunderstorm rolled through the mountains, turning his trail back to his own claim into a churning river of mud. He was trapped with her. The cabin's roof, a patchwork of sod and rotting timber, began to leak, first in drips, then in steady streams. They spent the night moving their few possessions, his bedroll, her small bundle of belongings, the dwindling supply of dried meat, to the driest corner, the sound of rain drumming on the roof a constant, miserable tattoo. The storm forced a proximity that was both uncomfortable and necessary. They worked together the next day to patch the roof, him on the outside layering fresh sod and pine boughs, her on the inside pointing out the leaks. It was during this task that he saw another side of her. A large section of sod slipped, and Jedediah, off balance on the slick roof, began to slide. Before he could fall, Lynn, with surprising speed, braced a fallen log against the cabin wall beneath him, giving his boot the purchase he needed to stop his descent. It was a small thing, an act of quick thinking, but it was done with a deliberate calm that surprised him. She was not helpless. She was merely out of her element. The storm passed, but their isolation was broken 2 days later. Jedediah had ridden his mule into the nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings grandly named Three Forks for salt and flour. The general store owner, a man named Peterson, whose main trade was gossip, was talking to two strangers. They were hard-looking men, their clothes worn but their gear expensive. The leader was a lean man with pale, watchful eyes and a smile that never reached them. His name, he said, was Fletcher. "We're looking for a girl," Fletcher said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "A Chinese girl, runaway servant from a big house in Sacramento. Got some strange ideas in her head. Her master's worried for her, you understand. Offering a reward." Peterson, his eyes gleaming with avarice, immediately thought of Jedediah. "Can't say I've seen a Chinese girl," he lied, looking straight at Jedediah, but his gaze shifted for a fraction of a second toward the mountains, toward Jedediah's claim. It was all the confirmation Fletcher needed. Jedediah bought his supplies, his gut twisting into a cold knot. He knew Fletcher was lying. The man didn't look like a concerned citizen. He looked like a wolf scenting blood. He rode his mule hard, pushing the poor animal faster than he ever had before. But they were on horseback. They were faster. He was still a mile from the cabin when he heard the horses. He dismounted, tied his mule to a tree, and crept forward, his Winchester now feeling like a part of him again. He saw them ride up to the cabin. Fletcher dismounted, his man staying in the saddle, rifle resting across his lap. "Hello, the cabin," Fletcher called, his voice carrying the same false pleasantness it had in the store. "We're looking for a Mr. Stone. We were told he might be able to help us." Jedediah watched from the tree line, his heart pounding. He saw a flicker of movement inside the cabin. Lynn was there, and she had heard. Fletcher tried again, his voice hardening slightly. "We know you're in there, and we know who you're with. Just send out the girl, and there'll be no trouble for you, friend." Suddenly, thick black smoke began to pour from the chimney. It wasn't the light gray smoke of a cook fire. It was an acrid, choking cloud that smelled of burning pitch and strange herbs. It billowed out, enveloping the front of the cabin. The man on the horse cursed, his mount shying away from the foul stench. Fletcher stepped back, his eyes watering, his pleasant demeanor gone, replaced by a snarl of fury. It was the opening Jedediah needed. He stepped out from the trees, leveling his rifle. "I believe the lady of the house is telling you to leave," he said, his voice flat and cold. The second man swung his rifle around, but Jedediah was faster. A single shot from the Winchester kicked a spray of dirt into the man's face. He cried out, dropping his weapon. Fletcher had his hand on his revolver, but he froze when he saw the look in Jedediah's eyes. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of a man who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. "You've made a mistake," Fletcher said, slowly raising his hands. "My second one today," Jedediah replied. "The first was not shooting you back in town. Now get on your horse and ride. Don't come back." He disarmed them, taking their revolvers and their spare ammunition. As they rode away, Fletcher turned in his saddle, his face a mask of cold hatred. The polite fiction was gone, and what lay beneath was raw and murderous. Jedediah knew with chilling certainty that he hadn't ended the threat. He had only delayed it. He had invited a war to his doorstep. But Jedediah was about to learn that two men with guns were far less dangerous than the piece of paper the woman kept hidden in the lining of her scarlet dress. That night, the small cabin felt like a fortress under siege. The silence of the mountains was no longer peaceful. It was filled with listening tension. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through Jedediah's veins. He sat on a stool by the door, his Winchester across his knees, while Lynn sat by the cold hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The shared danger had forged a fragile trust between them, but it was a trust built on assumptions. He knew she was in trouble, and she knew he was willing to stand in its way. Neither of them knew why. Finally, in the flickering light of a single tallow lamp, she looked at him. Her expression was one of solemn decision. She rose and took the red silk dress from a wooden peg on the wall. It was the only beautiful thing in the squalid cabin, a defiant splash of color against the grim reality of their situation. With a small sharp knife he hadn't seen before, she carefully picked at a seam in the thick inner lining of the garment. Her movements were precise, her fingers steady despite the fear that still shadowed her eyes. After a moment, she pulled out a small, flat packet wrapped in oilskin. She unfolded it on the rough-hewn table, smoothing the creases with the palm of her hand. Inside was a document, a heavy piece of paper covered in elegant, flowing characters he couldn't read, alongside a block of English text. At the bottom were two signatures and an official-looking seal from the city of San Francisco. She looked at him, her dark eyes pleading for understanding. She pointed to the English words. Jedediah leaned closer, the lamplight glinting off his rifle barrel. He read the words aloud, softly. Deed of transfer. Golden Dragon Shipping Line. He looked at her, confused. Then he saw her name, clearly printed. Lynn Sue Yin. And below it, the name of her father, a man whose name he recognized from the newspapers, a merchant of immense wealth and power who had died a few months back. This is yours?" he asked, his voice a whisper. She nodded, her expression a mixture of grief and fear. With halting words and expressive gestures, the story came tumbling out. She was not a servant. She was the man's only child, his heir. Her uncle, a man named Bow, his father's brother, had coveted the company. Upon her father's death, Bow had moved swiftly, declaring her lost at sea, producing forged documents and bribed witnesses. He had seized control of the entire enterprise. She had escaped San Francisco with nothing but the dress on her back and this one true deed, the original, which her father had given her for safekeeping. Fletcher was not a bounty hunter. He was an assassin, hired by her uncle to erase the last piece of evidence that could expose his crime. Her. The weight of it settled on Jedediah, heavier than any winter snow. This wasn't about a runaway servant. It was about a fortune. It was about power and greed on a scale he could barely comprehend. And he, a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, was standing right in the middle of it. He looked from the deed on the table to the young woman who was trusting him with her life. He had made a choice on the trail, a choice to protect a stranger. Now he had to make another. Knowing the truth, knowing the depth of the danger, he had to choose whether to see it through. His decision was made for him before the sun rose. A flicker of orange light against the cabin's single window woke him from a light, fitful sleep. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. He peered through a crack in the wall. The dry summer grass at the edge of the clearing was on fire. Fletcher had returned, and he had brought more men. And they weren't planning a direct assault. They were using the mountain itself as a weapon, setting a blaze that would sweep up the valley, trapping them in the cabin, turning it into a funeral pyre. It was a cruel, smart plan. The fire would destroy the cabin, their bodies, and the precious deed, leaving nothing but ash and questions nobody would bother to answer. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Lynn. Her eyes went to the flames, which were already climbing the nearest pines with a hungry roar. "We must run," she whispered, grabbing the deed from the table. Jedediah looked at the fire, then at the small cabin he'd been staying in, and thought of his own homestead 2 valleys over. The half-finished sod house, the tilled earth, the mule, it was all he had in the world. It was his anchor, his proof that he could be more than just a man with a gun. Fleeing now meant abandoning it all. It meant running into the high country with nothing but the clothes on their backs, hunted by men who would not stop. It meant giving up the one thing he had fought so hard to build. It was a choice that would cost him everything he owned. He looked at Lynn, her face illuminated by the terrible orange glow, her hand clutching the paper that was both her birthright and her death warrant. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, the same steel he'd seen when she held the skinning knife. She was not asking to be saved. She was preparing to fight for her life, with or against him. In that moment, Jedediah Stone made his choice. He slung his saddlebags over his shoulder, stuffing them with ammunition and the last of the dried meat. "The fire's moving uphill," he said, his voice steady and calm. "They'll expect us to run for the high pass. We're not going to. We're going down, through the smoke. Stay close behind me." He was choosing her. He was choosing this fight. And as he kicked open the back door of the cabin and plunged into the choking smoke, he knew he was leaving his quiet life behind forever, burning in the grass with the rest of his past. By the time the first snows fell that November, the mountains seemed a world away. Jedediah and Lynn stood on the boardwalk in Helena, the air crisp and cold, the sounds of the territorial capital a noisy contrast to the silence they had known. Their flight through the fire and smoke had been a desperate, harrowing ordeal. They had survived on Jedediah's knowledge of the land and Lynn's surprising resilience, emerging from the wilderness days later, starved and smoke-stained, but alive. In Helena, Jedediah used the last of his money, every last silver dollar he had saved to send a telegraph. It was a long message sent to a lawyer in San Francisco whose name Lynn had provided, a man who had been a trusted friend of her father. For weeks they waited, living in a cheap boarding house, Jedediah taking odd jobs hauling freight to keep them fed. He felt the weight of his abandoned homestead like a phantom limb, a constant ache for a life that was no longer his. Then the reply came. It was not a telegraph, but a man, a lawyer's agent, crisp and professional, who arrived by stagecoach with a packet of documents and a bank draft for an amount that made Jedediah's head spin. The deed was ironclad. Lynn's identity was confirmed. Faced with incontrovertible proof and the threat of a U.S. Marshal, Bow's empire of lies had crumbled. In a desperate bid for leniency, he had confessed everything, implicating Fletcher and his men, who were apprehended near the Canadian border. The Golden Dragon shipping line belonged to its rightful owner. Now they stood outside the Territorial Land Office. Lynn, no longer in a scarlet dress but in a practical woolen skirt and coat, held a new deed in her hands. It was for his claim. She had bought it back for him, along with the adjoining 100 acres. At the edge of town, a freighter was already unloading a wagon full of fresh-cut lumber, new tools, and supplies, everything he needed to rebuild, and more. "It is not enough," Lynn said quietly, looking at the deed, "for what you lost." Jedediah looked past her, toward the distant snow-capped peaks. He thought of his half-built sod house, now likely a heap of ash and mud. He had lost a home, but he had been wrong about what a home was. He had thought it was a piece of land, a roof over his head, a barrier against the world. He had thought peace was found in solitude. He looked down at the woman beside him, at the quiet strength in her face. He had run to the mountains seeking peace and found a war. He had tried to bury the man he was and had been forced to become him again. But in that fire, in that fight, he had found something more valuable than solitude. He had found a purpose. He had found a partner. The final image that stuck in his mind was not the fire, or the guns, or the fear. It was the first thing he had seen, a flash of brilliant scarlet against weathered gray wood. An impossible thing in an impossible place. He had thought it was a sign of trouble. He realized now it was a sign of life, of a courage he hadn't known he was looking for. A man can't build a life by running from who he is, he thought. Sometimes the only way to find your peace is to stand and fight for the person who makes the world feel like home again. And as they turned to walk toward the wagon of new lumber, he knew he was finally building something that would last.